learn for March 2018 from the League of Women Voters of Salina. I need to tell you that Salina League of Women Voters, well, the League of Women Voters generally is a nonpartisan, non-profit organization of women and men of every political stripe, and we work across the country to promote citizen action on local, state, and national issues and on voter registration. And I'm going to introduce our member, Bruce Wyatt, to introduce the program.
Brian is from, his education is at Fort Hays State with BS in wildlife biology and a master's in fisheries biology. He works for the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks and Tourism. He has for 2 years, and based in Salina. And in general, Brian has a number of responsibilities in addition to lighting fires. He conducts wildlife surveys, educational programs, handles the walk-in hunting thing that you'll see sometimes as you're driving out in the country. You'll see the signs that say walk-in hunting permitted with various grasslands. And he works with private landowners in construction, reconstruction of their grasslands. We've worked with, Margaret and I have worked with Brian on our grasslands, and one of the purposes, of course, is habitat for birds and wildlife, as well as, of course, for cattle. So we thought it would be very appropriate at a moment when you can't burn, because everybody is under burn bans, to at least then we could talk about it and be ready to light the match. I'm just joking, when we're ready. So please join me in welcoming Brian Sheridan.
This is a very general presentation. This isn't, the specifics on when and how to do a burn. There are burn workshops every year across the state if you want to know more information about how to do that. This is more of a step back. All right, why are we doing this? What's the history of it? Why do we do it now? And what are some issues associated with burning? My presentation style, I will do some just talking through the presentation, but I like to try and keep people engaged. So I have questions. And this is informal, there's no judgments here. So when I ask a question, I would appreciate some answers, right? And
There'll be a test afterwards.
well, I'm not providing a test, but just like I tell the kids when I'm doing a youth presentation, I can stand up here all day and wait. So anyway, with that being said, our first question, what is a wildfire?
Fire out of control with a 90-mile-an-hour wind all in Kansas.
All right. Out of control fire. So surprisingly, there are a lot of irrelevant definitions for wildfire. One of the best ones that I found is this: any large fire that spreads rapidly and is hard to extinguish. Personally, I had a little caveat to that. It is unwanted and uncontrolled. Uncontrolled goes a little bit along with hard to extinguish, and the pointer doesn't show up on the screen here, but the main thing is it's unwanted. We don't want wildfires. When most people think about wildfires, and unfortunately when a lot of people think about prescribed fires, this is what they think of. Big expanses of just black charred ground, death, destruction. And this picture is from 2016 from the Anderson Creek wildfire. If my memory serves me correctly, at the time, this was the largest wildfire recorded in Kansas in modern history. Fast forward a year, and we have the Clark County, the wildfire that went through in 2017. You see on the map here, it says that about 500,000 acres were burned. 461,000 acres were burned in just Clark County. Obviously, it burned into some other counties. At the same time this was going on, there were wildfires in Lincoln County and Russell County, Trego County, Reno County. There were wildfires a little bit everywhere. All told, from these wildfires at that same time period, there was about 651,000 acres burned. So, for reference, 461,000 burned in Clark County, but the total area of Clark County is about 650,000 acres. So the equivalent of a county in Kansas was burned through wildfire last year. Why? What led to this? Well, there are several different factors. I can't talk about all of them, but we had a lot of early precipitation over the last few years, which led to a lot of growth of plants, whether it's grass, trees, forbs, whatever. And then the water just turned off for months and months. And so these plants, they grow and they're nice and they're healthy, and then they dry up and they go dormant or they die, and that fuel builds up. Add a little heat, add some wind, add an ignition source, and you've got a wildfire. To make it worse, by not using prescribed burning, that fuel builds up every year. No burn, lots of fuel, no burn, lots of fuel, builds up every year. And it's just asking for disaster. So, prescribed fire. What is that? Again, lots of definitions, lots of potential definitions. However, the best one that I found is actually from an NRCS publication out of Iowa, and it's fire that's applied. We put it out there on purpose. We did it to a predetermined area, to an area that we have set aside for prescribed fire, within a prescribed set of conditions and dates. So we know what the wind speed needs to be. We know what kind of precipitation needs to be. We know what the wind direction needs to be. How many folks are going to be there? We know all of those details. With appropriate safety precautions. Do we have fire breaks? Do we have the right equipment? Have we communicated with the right authorities? And it's to achieve a specific purpose. This is not arson. This is for wildlife or for forage, whatever it happens to be. So this is a detailed definition, but it's very appropriate for what we're talking about. So instead of thinking about these big expanses of destruction with prescribed fire, you should really be thinking about safety and equipment and directions. These are all pictures of burns that I've helped on. The top left one is a burn from Ottawa County, a private landowner. He had a few folks there. I was the only agency person, the only government personnel. Almost nobody had any fire experience. His house is right here. He burned right next to his house. But he put the burn off a couple of days because the wind wasn't the right direction. He had his fire breaks and everything ready. We had no issues with that fire. You can see the fuel here. You can see the grass that we were burning. So there was a lot of fuel. We had no issues. The other two pictures are from Smoky Hill Wildlife Area from out of Kannapolis, and it was almost all agency personnel helping with that burn. And this was actually a summer burn. I think we burned in August or maybe early September. However, just like a wildfire, we do get these times of black, right, of destruction, and we get smoke. The top right is another picture from out of Kannapolis, but focus on this bottom left picture. And this burn was conducted as a private landowner on the Saline and Ellsworth County line. And 640 acres, so a square mile. Obviously, it's black. The burn was done on April 13th, and I went out to check it out on April 18th and took some pictures. For reference, there's a really big hill, since my pointer's not working, I'm just using my hand. There's a really big hill on the top, or on the left-hand side of that photo. Now, a month later, I went to the same area for a different project. But because I was close, I decided to mosey on over and check it out, take some pictures. And this is what I found. Exactly a month later, from April 18th to May 18th, last year, 2017. And you see, it's not black anymore. It's green, it's lush, it's beautiful. The cattle, you can see the cattle in the middle of the photo, they're loving it. All this nice tender grass that they're eating, right? The grass loves it. This is buffalo grass flowering. The forbs, which are wildflowers and weeds, it's basically anything that's not a grass, tree, or shrub. They love it. They're flowering. The prairie wants fire. And here's a question. Does the prairie care, does the ecosystem care about the difference between a wildfire and a prescribed fire? No, it absolutely does not. But we care. As humans, we care. We don't want wildfires to go through. Wildfires destroy property, they can destroy livestock, they can destroy lives. However, prescribed fire is something that will help the landscape without, hopefully without detrimenting us. Okay? All right, some more questions. Why did we not historically have trees on the prairie?
Fire.
Fire? What else?
Drought.
What?
Great, those are the same answer, drought and water. All right, so climate was definitely a factor, especially further west where we just don't get very much precipitation. There's not enough water to support a forest. Wildlife would come through and they would trample and eat and everything else. And of course, fire. That's why we're here, right? To hear about fire. So where did the fire come from?
Lightning.
The very first answer everybody gives, lightning. Absolutely. It still happens. Lightning will strike, it can start a fire. However, there's more and more evidence, and I'm not the guy looking at all the evidence, so this is secondhand, but there's more and more evidence that most of the fires historically were not started by lightning, but by Native Americans. Why?
So cooking the food.
All right, so what was that? Cooking food, what else?
Blue buffalo.
All right, food. Bison, right? They want protein, they want meat, they want to eat something. They were observant. They noted that wherever there was nice fresh grass after a burn, wow, it's amazing, there's also bison, right? Or other wildlife too, but it's easy for us to think about bison. And so they lit fires intentionally to know where their food was going to be, basically. All right, how often did fire go through a specific area? I mean, fire was everywhere at different times, but how often, let's look at the Smoky Hills. How often did fire go through historically?
Per year.
Every year.
5 years.
All right. Again, I'm not the guy looking at all the evidence and everything, but historically, we think about every 3 to 5 years. Out west, it would be less frequent because there's not as much fuel. But even further east in the Flint Hills, it probably wasn't every year because you reduce the fuel every time a fire goes through. It'd be about every 3 years. So what happened? What happened to the fire?
It burned all the water.
We did. We built houses, we built cities, we built roads, we built fences. And in the midst of doing all of that, we suppressed fire. So what happens when you suppress fire over an extended period of time? You have a lot of unintended consequences, most notably trees. Do you think this looks historically like a prairie? No. All right, so that's a little bit of the history. Now I'm going to talk about why we are burning now. Don't we want a forest in Kansas? Well, I'm going to talk about each one of those, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. So, it's still going to be brief. I'm not going to bore you all day here. First thing, fuel reduction, right? We talked about that layering effect. As you go through and fuel just layers and layers and layers. What does a fire need? It needs fuel, it needs oxygen, and what else? Ignition, heat or ignition source. So if we can take out one of those factors, then that helps us prevent wildfires, right? So how do we reduce the fuel for wildfires? You burn it. This, it's a cell phone photo, so it's kind of blurry, but that's just grass. Thick grass. But if there's an ignition source, it's going to go up in flames.
Like driving a truck over.
Potentially. So we reduce fuel by burning under control. How much fuel is left after we burn? The first year, basically nothing, right? But do we need to burn every year? Probably not. So if we burn periodically, we can help reduce that layering effect and reduce the fuel over time. All right, we'll talk about some invaders now. Technically, eastern red cedars are native to Kansas, right? But they were controlled by fire. So, something that I found interesting, the Kansas Forest Service on their website, they had a couple different things I wanted to say. First was that they estimate that a prairie can be completely displaced by trees if they're not controlled within 40 years. That's 40. That's less than a lifetime for most people, right? That's kind of scary. And then there's this quote, and I cut a little bit out, but since 1936, when they did the first forest survey in Kansas forests, in quotes, have increased 3.9 million acres. And it's speculative, but they think primarily this is in uplands and from woody encroachment into grasslands. So we are continuously losing the prairie. Everybody's got lots of different motivations, right? So some happen because they might be absentee landowners that they're just not using it. Some people might be lazy. I mean, let's be honest. Some people just don't want to put in the effort to burn or cut trees. Some people think that this is the best wildlife habitat you can have. There are more and more landowners that are buying ground in Kansas just to hunt on, and even though I know that that's not the best habitat out there, they think, all right, lots of deer, they're going to be here. I could talk more about that, but I won't. So it just depends on the person. In addition to just trees, some species that are invasive, technically invasive, can be controlled by fire. This is a handbook from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're actually, on that cover photo, they're burning salt cedar, which is not the same thing as a cedar tree. It's an invasive species to help control it. Sometimes you need fire and maybe chemical or some other treatment, but you can use fire to help control Phragmites. They're talking about controlling Sericea lespedeza with fire during the summer, growing season burn. So you can use fire for a lot of different things. Not all invasives can be controlled by fire, but some of them absolutely can. Why else do we burn? For the plants. This is my favorite slide probably. This is why we burn. Look at this. Burning helps to promote diversity and vigor of grassland plants. And it's not just the forbs, it's not just the wildflowers that you see up here, but it's also the grass. So it helps to recycle nutrients. You can imagine that layering again, all those nutrients are locked up in those dead plants and they're not going anywhere. They're not decomposing fast enough to be used by everything else. burning helps to recycle those nutrients. You know, we go back to some of those pictures that I had up before, how much sunlight is actually hitting the soil? Very little. Even if there's no trees, that grass over time completely blocks out the sun. So it helps, burning helps to open up the canopy, help open up the soil for that seed bank to restore itself and those plants that haven't seen sunlight in years to actually come back and grow. The prairie wants fire. And pretty much directly related to that, for the next couple of things I'm going to talk about, wildlife like fire too. In fact, I found this illustration, a show of bobwhite and a wild turkey burning, because we're not doing it, so they're going to do it themselves. So what kind of wildlife wants you to burn? Well, these are deer. These are picture of deer. On the top, we've got mule deer. We don't really have those so much here, at least not regularly, but we do in western Kansas. And on the bottom, those are white-tailed deer. We absolutely have those. They like it when you burn because they've got areas to hang out that are open. They've got fresh new grass and new forbs and new shrubs to graze, that are highly nutritious. What about birds, you say? Well, I will tell you about birds. These are bobwhite quail. And adult bobwhites, they eat a lot of seeds and different things. But you can imagine being this little cute, fuzzy bobwhite chick and think about an old CRP field that you've seen that hasn't had anything done to it for a while. How easy is it for that animal to run through? They can't do it. There's too many obstacles. Burning helps to create those lanes and those open areas where those new chicks can actually run. Not only that, we just saw a picture of all the forbs and the wildflowers that are growing after a burn. Well, forbs attract insects. A baby bird like that, their main diet is insects because they need that protein to grow. So by burning, we also have increased the food that is available for those little birds. And that's not just for bobwhite, that's prairie chickens, pheasants, and all those birds. Speaking of prairie chickens, these are prairie chickens. On the top, we've got lesser prairie chickens, which again, we don't have those so much out here, but in western Kansas we do. The bottom are greater prairie chickens, which we absolutely have around here. Not just Saline County, but all of the counties surrounding us. I'll talk a little bit more about prairie chickens later, but they like lots of different types of habitat. They need thick grass for nesting. They need those brood-rearing habitats where you've got lots of forbs for their chicks to run through and eat the bugs and stuff. There have been some studies recently that show that some prairie chickens avoid freshly burned areas. Obviously, those ones are not. But it's also important to think about the longer picture, the big picture of this. And if you're burning every few years, it's not just year one that matters. It's all the subsequent years that also matter to these animals. You say, oh, but Brian, these are just animals that you hunt. I don't care. Well, if you've increased the forbs on the landscape, you're also helping pollinators, right? Bees and butterflies. You're also helping other wildlife, grassland birds, Henslow sparrow, grasshopper sparrow. These birds don't like trees. They are prairie birds. What do they eat? They eat insects. So, again, burning helps to increase the amount of not just cover, that's not thick cover, but nice new cover, but also the amount of food that is available for these birds. You say, well, what about everything else? Well, over time, as you have these forbs grow up again and they seed out and they drop their seeds, you're increasing potential food for small mammals. If you increase small mammals, then you also have potential to increase other reptiles like snakes, hawks, owls. Burning is not just specific for one type of wildlife. It's a whole ecosystem process. Everything is affected, and for the native prairie, everything is really benefited. That's something, after the big wildfires went through, I was reading an article that said that the prairie was destroyed. And I don't even know if I finished the article, because the prairie was not destroyed. Houses were destroyed and livestock was destroyed, yeah, and that's bad. But the prairie loved it. And in some areas where they have not seen stream flow for years and years, most likely because of all the trees that were sucking up the water, they now have stream flow again because the fire took those out. So fire is a wonderful process for the prairie. All right, agriculture, right? We burn for ag. And I'm just going to talk about forage, but it doesn't have to just be cattle, but mostly we burn for cattle, right? And this is similar, again, to the plants. It's related directly to the plants, and it's similar to what I talked about for the wildlife. By recycling those nutrients, you are providing higher quality and quantity of food for your livestock. It increases the crude protein. It increases the palatability. It enhances how easily that plant is digested, right? Plus, imagine being a cow, right? First, actually, just imagine this. Let's say you like to eat chocolate cake. I heard this somewhere else. I didn't make this up. Somebody else did. Let's say you like to eat chocolate cake, right? But every time you try to eat it, you get stabbed in the face by a fork. Would you want to eat it? Probably not. It's the same with cattle. They want to eat that grass. They want to eat those forbs, right? But if there's all that excess material, they just keep getting poked in the face. They don't want that, just like anybody else. So burning helps open that up. Studies have shown that it increases the amount of weight that a cow can gain, right? Because you're providing this highly nutritious food source. It can improve the distribution of your cattle so that they're not just hitting the same spot year after year after year. It can actually spread them out. There actually have been some studies in Oklahoma that showed that burning can reduce the number of parasites on the landscape, like ticks and face flies. And if you can imagine, you say, well, I'm not a farmer, I'm not a rancher, I don't care. But by decreasing the parasites on the landscape, then you can potentially decrease the amount of chemicals that you're using out there also. So I will talk a little bit more about this system called patch burn grazing. Instead of me describing it exactly, I will show you this video.
Patch burn grazing, good for cattle and birds. Here's how it works. A patch of native prairie or warm season grass is burned right before cattle are stocked in mid-April. The cattle graze mostly on this newly burned patch for the lush, nutritious new sprouts. The next year, a new patch is burned and heavily grazed, allowing last year's burned patch to recover and become brood-rearing cover for grassland birds. The taller grasses offer nesting sites for grassland birds. It's a win-win for all. Cattle producers have high-quality forage for their livestock during summer months, and grassland birds have a patchwork of different habitat types for food and cover.
So that's patch burn grazing, all right? And in some circles, it's a little controversial still, and it's hard to get a lot of producers on board. But especially in the Flint Hills, more and more producers are starting to do this. For wildlife, a lot of us are already on board. We say, yep, we want that mosaic, that shifting mosaic of habitat types. So this is really a good system. And this is a video that I'll show real quick, just a short clip of it, not the whole thing, from the Lesser Prairie Chicken Initiative. And everything that they say about the Lesser Prairie Chickens is true also for Greater Prairie Chicken.
What makes the patch burning system so compatible with prairie chicken biology is that lesser prairie chickens need taller, denser structure for nesting, and they need more open areas to rear their young. In a patch burning system, you'll have 1/3 that was recently disturbed, say in the last year. You have another 1/3 that was disturbed maybe 2 to 3 years ago, and then you'll have your final 1/3 that hadn't been burned for 3 to 5 years. And it's just perfect for prairie chickens.
A couple of things to talk about for issues. And I don't know the history of this fire on the photo. I don't know if that was a prescribed fire or wildfire or what it was, but some of the same issues occur from both wildfire and prescribed fire, right? Smoke can be an issue. Smoke can cause accidents, it can cause property damage, it can cause human health concerns with air pollution, right? But I'll say this quickly about smoke. Most of those concerns can be alleviated by making your plan and following it, by coming up with all the considerations ahead of time. And as a person who is doing a burn, you have to be willing to go out there and everything is ready, everybody's out there, and maybe the wind changes direction or the wind comes up. You have to be able to say, nope, sorry guys, we're done. We're not doing this today. Otherwise, things like this could potentially happen. But if you do it, if you burn under the right circumstances, then that alleviates almost all of the problems that occur. One thing I will say, most folks that burn in Kansas do it during the same period of time, and that causes issues, especially with like Nebraska. We get a south wind and it blows a lot of smoke over there. They don't like it. But again, that can be alleviated some by using the proper conditions and spreading out the burns. You don't necessarily have to burn in a 2-week time period in the spring. You can burn pretty much any time of year depending on what your goals are. And then this is the one that scares everybody, right? Spot fires and escape fires. And a spot fire is what happens when you've got a prescribed burn and it starts to get out of hand, but it's usually a small area, right? Escape fire is what happens if you don't get it under control. It basically is a wildfire. Again, it's the same thing as with smoke. If you're burning under the proper conditions and you have done all of the proper safety precautions, taken all of those, then you don't have to worry so much about it. I mean, you still want to think about it, but you don't have to worry as much. If you've got your fire breaks, if you have the right wind, then most of those are concerns that you should not have to deal with. There was and these are both spot fires. These are just small fires that got out. There's another study. Oklahoma does a lot of fire research. So there is a study in Oklahoma from 2015 to 16, and prescribed fire, out of 300,000 acres of prescribed fire, not wildfire, they burned 300,000 acres that was reported, and there was a 3% or 3.6% likelihood of something becoming an escape fire. There was a longer term study before that, and I don't remember how many years it covered, but it was several years in Oklahoma, and they actually had a lower prevalence. It was like less than 2%, 1.4 or something percent likelihood of having an escape fire. Both of those studies, over a decade probably, out of both of those studies, no insurance claims were filed. So it must not have been that horrible. All right, so most of these folks are not doing this alone. Help is out there. There are several agencies and organizations around that help and provide education or planning or on-the-ground actual help. So there are resources that are definitely available for everyone. And I'm not going to go to all these sites, but these are sites that I think you might be interested in. The top one is specifically about burning. The other two, the Kansas Outback one is from a person in the Red Hills in south central Kansas, and he has a lot of stuff about fire, the wildfires, prescribed fire on his blog. He has some of that stuff, some pictures from after the fires when stream flow started up again, returned. And then the bottom one, the Prarie ecologist, I actually used a couple of his photos that I cited before, but that's actually out of Nebraska. And the ecologist works for the Nature Conservancy, and he's also a photographer. And so he has some awesome pictures if you want to see what they're doing and what a native prairie would look like. He's got some really cool photos. And that's all I have today. So I would be happy to answer any more questions. I might not have all the answers, but shoot away.
Natural burn, does that have to be Could that be really small acreages, like 5 or 6 acres burned at a time?
Yeah, it
Still
can
gonna
be.
benefit?
It's not going to benefit. I mean, if you're doing that small of an acreage, you're probably not grazing it
Right.
either. But it'll still absolutely benefit wildlife. Even if it's just a small area, you're still getting that patchwork of habitat types.
Yeah, I was thinking of some people I know that own recreational areas that they only have like 20 or 40 acres.
Sure.
But none of it's been burned for a long, long time.
And the benefit to that too is that it's more intensive in that you have to burn every year, but it's also smaller pieces. And so that's usually more manageable for folks than trying to burn a full section of grass. Most folks are not equipped to do that. But if you burn 10 acres here, 20 acres, 50 acres, 230 acres, whatever, that becomes more manageable depending on the operation.
Do you have to have a permit for any type of burning in every
Well,
county?
It just depends on the county, but most of them would like you to have a permit or at least call in advance. That's whenever you're going to do a prescribed burn, you really need to let the authorities know, whether it's a rural fire department or somebody else, the disaster or emergency management, whoever it might be. They need to know what's going on, and they might tell you, nope, can't do it. That's also a good resource because they can tell you whether or not you're in a burn ban. All of Kansas, except for the very northwest corner of Cheyenne County in northwest Kansas, was in drought. Let's say the pasture is not completely overgrown. A fire will typically kill a 6-foot or 8-foot cedar tree that's shorter, right? A taller tree might die, it might not, it's hard to tell. However, when you get a whole bunch of cedar trees together, that fire burns very hot and it's more likely to kill more cedar trees. It's not whether or not fire will help the situation, it's whether or not it's safe to do. Because trees obviously burn for a lot longer, they smolder, they burn hotter, and there's more possibility for things to get out of control. So you can still do it, but you need to have really good fire breaks and the perfect conditions. Otherwise, there needs to be some mechanical removal first before you think about doing that. And what a lot of guys will do, or folks will do, producers, they will have a pasture that maybe it's not a forest yet, but it's getting close. They'll cut a bunch of trees and they'll pile them up around other trees. And so then you've got open areas, but you've got fire that's still hitting all those trees too. And you're using the heat from the dead trees to kill the trees that are still alive.
Thank you. And my question is, I know some of the rivers in Kansas have trees and then you got west there's less, but where was that? Is that where the tall grass prairie is, that the trees on the rivers ended also because there wasn't enough water? Or, I've been really curious about that.
Well, I don't think there's a line.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of these areas change over time.
Right.
And maybe Kansas forest is something that's in the future. I don't know. But, you know, the far eastern reaches of Kansas, they had some forest, especially southeast Kansas had a little bit of forest. Flint Hills is tall grass prairie.
Right.
Smoky Hills and most of Kansas is in mixed grass prairie, and just the far western part of the state is short grass. But that shifts, that moves over time. And so it really depends on the year. Even out west, if you don't have a fire that goes through, let's say for 10 years or 15 years, you'll still have trees grow. Most little trees are very susceptible to fire.
They'd kill them out.
And so I imagine that there would be some big, like cottonwoods, that didn't get hit by the fire, or once they get so big, the fire doesn't hurt them anymore, right? But other species, cedar trees especially, cedars are very susceptible to fire. So those just, except for on bluffs and sharp areas where fire couldn't reach, those areas just wouldn't have had trees. And most like native prairie streams wouldn't be like we think of today where it's straight drop-offs from erosion. They would have been wide and shallower where the grass just sloped down and everything into them. And you would still have some trees, and the fire might not have reached all of them, but it'd be way less than what we see today. I think even out west, I think there's more trees now than there were historically. Windbreaks are very popular all over Kansas, and in western Kansas especially, to try and prevent wind erosion, because obviously out here we think more about water erosion and water running off, but out west, when you've got bare soil and you've got 40-mile-an-hour winds every day, that erodes a lot of soil, dust bowl, right? Windbreaks are a little bit controversial. Some folks say that they're good, and maybe they're good for erosion. Other people say they're bad, that you don't get as much productivity next to a windbreak, but I don't know all the details on that. But yeah, windbreaks are very common, and I'm from Rush County right there too, so right next to Barton County. So I know all about it.